At precisely 6:04 a.m., I opened my front door in my robe and found Karen. Not just any Karen. The Karen. Clipboard in hand, fanny pack strapped tight, Bluetooth headset blinking like a warning signal. She stood flanked by 2 HOA rent-a-cops and a locksmith who was already drilling into my doorframe. She announced with the smuggest tone I'd ever heard, "This property is being repossessed by the Pinecrest Heights Community Association." I took one sip of my coffee, let out a long sigh, reached into my robe pocket, and calmly flashed my badge. "State Attorney General's office," I said in my most professional voice. "You just made a career-ending mistake." The drilling stopped. The rent-a-cops took a step back. Margaret Whitfield, our HOA president, went from triumphant to terrified in exactly 2.3 seconds. Her clipboard actually trembled in her manicured hands as she processed what she was seeing. The early morning sun glinted off my official state badge, and I watched the color drain from her spray-tanned face like someone had pulled a plug. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up here. My name is Trevor Mackenzie, 39 years old, and I'm not what you'd call flashy. I'm a quiet guy who enjoys tending to my bonsai trees and working through Sunday crossword puzzles. I had recently moved to Pinecrest Heights, one of those luxury planned communities where every lawn looks identical and every mailbox seems to have its own personality disorder. The houses all featured the same 3 approved color schemes, and heaven help you if you wanted to paint your door anything other than heritage blue, colonial red, or estate black. I work in the state capitol, about 2 hours away from here. My job title? Assistant Attorney General, Special Investigations Division. It's not something I advertise to my neighbors. I prefer staying incognito, just another resident trying to enjoy suburban life. My work involves prosecuting white-collar crime, corporate fraud, and ironically enough, cases of organizational corruption. But Margaret Whitfield, our self-declared Community Excellence Director and HOA President, had other plans for me. Apparently, my unapproved birdbath and lack of a proper seasonal wreath were grounds for what she considered social excommunication. The harassment started with letters, always typed in 12-point Times New Roman font and signed with an aggressive purple Sharpie scrawl. The first one read, "Violation, non-standard shrub trimming technique observed." Then came "Violation, curtains not within approved beige spectrum." My personal favorite was "Violation, suspicious silence after 9 p.m. suggesting potential illicit activities." Each letter arrived with the pompous authority of a royal decree, hand-delivered by Margaret herself at the most inconvenient times. 7 a.m. on Saturdays. During dinner parties. Once, memorably, while I was in my driveway talking to my mother on speakerphone, Margaret would stand there in her coordinated tracksuit, tapping her French manicured nails on her clipboard while reading each violation aloud in a condescending tone that suggested I was a particularly slow kindergartner. She'd pause dramatically between each word, saying things like, "Your mailbox numbers are in Helvetica font," when clearly, the bylaws specify Arial bold. The irony was that her own house had curtains that were decidedly more cream than beige, but apparently rules were for other people. Then the fines started rolling in. $50 for grass that was supposedly 1 millimeter too tall, measured with an actual ruler she carried in her fanny pack. $200 for parking my car at what Margaret deemed an improper angle, specifically 17 degrees off parallel when the maximum allowed was 15. $950 for what she called emotionally disruptive solar panel glare that was causing widespread community distress. She even posted a notice on the HOA bulletin board with large red letters asking, "Is Trevor Mackenzie hiding something?" accompanied by a printed photo of me carrying groceries like I was some kind of international fugitive caught in the act of buying organic produce. The covert tactics escalated from there. I have security camera footage of Margaret literally crawling through my backyard at 11 p.m. wearing what can only be described as a suburban ninja outfit, all black athletic wear with a headlamp, claiming later she was there to verify weed density compliance. She filed an anonymous tip to code enforcement, alleging I was running a surveillance operation from my home. The tip was signed, "A Concerned Citizen M.W., which wasn't exactly subtle. The code enforcement officer who showed up actually apologized to me, saying he'd dealt with Margaret before and knew this was nonsense. Technically, I was conducting surveillance, but it was for legitimate state investigations involving a multi-million-dollar Medicare fraud case, not whatever paranoid fantasy she'd concocted about me being a Russian spy or underground casino operator. things got progressively more ridiculous and intrusive. She measured the distance between my trash cans with a tape measure at 5:30 in the morning, photographing them from multiple angles like a crime scene investigator. She documented my windows from every conceivable position, claiming my blinds violated the uniformity clause because they were tilted at inconsistent angles. She even hired a private investigator to follow me to work, though he gave up after 2 days and actually apologized to me later. He told me Margaret had convinced him I was running some sort of criminal enterprise, but when he realized I was just going to the state capitol building every day, he refunded her money and told her to stop wasting his time. Her campaign reached absurd new heights when she started documenting what she called behavioral violations. She claimed my habit of reading the newspaper on my porch at 6:30 a.m. was a deliberate attempt to surveil other residents. My weekend jogs were suspicious movement patterns. The fact that I ordered takeout twice a week suggested I was having secret meetings with unknown individuals. She presented all of this at an HOA meeting with a PowerPoint presentation titled The Trevor Problem, a clear and present danger to community values. The HOA meetings themselves became increasingly bizarre. Margaret would spend the first 30 minutes discussing my various infractions while I sat in the back row, taking notes for what would eventually become evidence in my case against her. She'd created a point system for violations, with different colored cards like we were in a twisted version of soccer. Yellow cards for minor infractions, red cards for major ones, and she'd actually invented a purple card for what she called crimes against community aesthetics. Other residents started rolling their eyes when my name came up, which was approximately every 3 minutes. One meeting, she spent 45 minutes discussing the unauthorized bird activity in my yard, claiming my bird bath was attracting undesirable avian elements. She had actually created a spreadsheet categorizing acceptable versus unacceptable bird species. Apparently, cardinals were fine, but blue jays were considered too aggressive for our peaceful community. She'd printed copies for everyone, laminated them, and expected us to study them like we were preparing for an ornithology exam. Her vendetta reached peak absurdity when she created what she called the Mackenzie Monitoring Subcommittee, consisting of herself and 2 other board members she'd bullied into compliance. They would meet weekly to discuss my violations, and the meeting minutes were public record. I later obtained copies that included entries like subject observed walking dog in counterclockwise direction, possible coded message to unknown parties, and subject's breathing patterns while retrieving mail suggest anti-community sentiment. The final straw came when she attempted to evict me using completely fabricated HOA powers. At 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, Margaret arrived with what she called her HOA eviction task force, which she'd apparently trademarked according to the matching t-shirts they wore. A locksmith was already mid-drill on my front door lock. Humming while he worked like this was perfectly normal. A makeshift sign reading, "Property seized by order of HOA," in bold letters was being hammered into my carefully maintained hydrangea bed by one of her minions. She stood there with her clipboard, reading from what she claimed was Article 7, Section 19C of the HOA Charter, a section that I later confirmed didn't actually exist. She declared in her most authoritative voice, complete with dramatic pauses, failure to submit ornamental decor plans 30 days prior to installation, combined with flagrant disregard for community harmony standards, is grounds for immediate property forfeiture under the expanded enforcement provisions I personally authored. That's when I calmly reached into my robe pocket and produced my badge. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. You could actually hear the morning birds chirping, which Margaret probably would have fined me for if she hadn't been frozen in shock. The locksmith's drill stopped mid-rotation, and he slowly backed away from my door like it might explode. One of the rent-a-cops started quietly removing the seizure sign from my flower bed while whistling innocently. Margaret's face went from her usual smugness to the pale white color of her designer tennis visor, then to a concerning shade of green. I stepped outside, letting my badge catch the morning sunlight for dramatic effect, and said in my calmest professional tone, "Would you mind repeating that accusation into my lapel mic? The State Attorney General's office is very interested in HOA overreach cases. We've been building a file on unauthorized property seizures, and you just became our star witness. Against yourself." 2 hours later, the scene had completely reversed. Margaret was sitting under the HOA gazebo, which had been repurposed as a field interview site for the State Investigative Compliance Unit. The same gazebo where she'd held her weekend violation tribunals was now her interrogation room. I sat across from her in my full badge and blazer mode, with a leather portfolio, 2 state investigators flanking me, and a DSLR camera recording everything. She kept trying to explain that she was protecting property values, but every explanation just dug her hole deeper. The charges I was documenting were extensive and honestly, almost comically criminal. Fraudulent fines that violated state consumer protection laws, with penalties she'd invented that had no basis in any actual HOA documents. Illegal entry onto private property without proper authority, documented by her own surveillance photos that she'd proudly date-stamped. Unauthorized impersonation of civil authority, which is a felony in our state carrying up to 5 years in prison. And my personal favorite, HOA funds being used to lease a golf cart specifically for what she called enhanced violation detection purposes, but which neighbors confirmed she used for personal errands, including trips to the country club. Every time someone mentioned the word embezzlement, Margaret's left eye would twitch involuntarily, like she was trying to wink but forgot how. The investigators had already pulled the HOA financial records from the bank, and what they found was stunning. Margaret had been systematically funneling HOA dues into personal projects for 3 years, leaving a paper trail so obvious it was almost insulting to actual criminals. The investigation blew wide open faster than anyone expected. It turned out Margaret had been using HOA funds for all sorts of personal expenses, and she hadn't even tried to hide it well. There was a community wellness retreat in Sedona that was actually her cousin's overpriced spa package. $30,000 in landscaping improvements that mysteriously only benefited her property, including a koi pond she claimed was a community water feature despite being in her backyard. Even a monthly consulting fee she paid to herself for being what she called a visionary leader and aesthetic guardian, which amounted to $2,000 a month for essentially harassing neighbors. We discovered she'd created fake vendor accounts and was paying herself through them. Premium Lawn Excellence LLC was just Margaret with a business checking account and a logo she'd made in Microsoft Paint. Aesthetic Compliance Consultants was her sister's company that had never consulted on anything except how to spend HOA money on Margaret's wishlist. The community's supposed security upgrade was just her son installing Ring doorbells she got on clearance, but billing the HOA for military-grade surveillance equipment at a 500% markup. Her fake company scheme was almost impressive in its audacity. She'd created Violation Processing Systems Inc., which charged the HOA $300 per violation letter sent when she was printing them on her home printer. Community Standards Enforcement LLC was supposedly providing security services, but it was just Margaret driving around in the golf cart taking pictures of people's homes. She even had Horticultural Compliance Associates, which was meant to be a landscaping review service, but was actually just her neighbor's teenager whom she paid $20 to agree with everything she said about people's gardens. The residents turned on her fast once word got out. HOA meetings, which used to be quiet affairs where Margaret lectured everyone about grass height and appropriate head shapes, devolved into absolute chaos. People who had been fined hundreds of dollars for minor infractions were demanding their money back with interest. One elderly couple revealed they'd almost lost their home because of accumulated fines Margaret had imposed for their wheelchair ramp not matching the approved color palette, even though ADA compliance should have overridden any HOA rules. Another family had been fined $5,000 over 2 years for violations that included excessive happiness during outdoor gatherings and non-standard frequency of garage door usage. They'd actually documented every single fine in a binder that was 3 inches thick. I released a formal report to the State Oversight Committee recommending full board dissolution and a forensic audit of the past 5 years of finances. The governor's office took notice immediately, with the governor himself calling it a textbook case of suburban tyranny. It turns out HOA corruption was becoming a hot-button issue in the state, and Margaret had just become the poster child for everything wrong with the system. News crews started showing up at Pinecrest Heights, interviewing residents about their experiences with Margaret's reign of terror. The arrest happened during a live-streamed HOA budget meeting that would go down in local history. Margaret was in the middle of explaining why the community needed to increase dues by 40% to fund what she called enhanced compliance initiatives, when 2 state troopers walked in with a warrant. As they placed her in handcuffs, she shouted with indignation, "I was the culture of this community. I maintained our standards. Without me, property values will plummet." Someone in the back of the room yelled back, "We hated your culture, Margaret. My petunias were never good enough for you." The room erupted in applause as she was led away, still trying to issue violations to the troopers for wearing non-approved footwear in the community center. The forensic audit revealed she had embezzled over $175,000 over 3 years through her various schemes. The judge wasn't amused by her defense that she was protecting property values and maintaining aesthetic excellence. She was convicted on 4 counts of embezzlement, 2 counts of fraud, 1 count of impersonating a civil authority, and surprisingly, 1 count of stalking for her midnight surveillance activities. The sentence came down hard. 3 to 5 years in state prison, full restitution of all stolen funds, and a $75,000 fine. When the judge read the sentence, Margaret's jaw dropped so far I thought it might hit the defendant's table. She turned to her lawyer and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "But I had a color-coded violation system. I laminated the guidelines.